Welcome, everyone, to the PCI Practical Matters podcast. Today we have our second myth of the 10 Myths of Government Contracting series. And our guest is Tim Sullivan. Take it away, Tim.
Thank you, John. Well, our myth today, myth number 2, is we should always protest. Now, as you might recall, the first myth we discussed was we should never protest. So now it looks like I'm just flipping the question. And in some sense I am, but stick with me. The decision to file a protest highlights one of the distinct features of contracting with the United States government. The decision itself involves a long list of questions and the pressure of having to decide whether to sue a potential customer or some agency that's already a customer as well. You have to make that decision in a very short time. So it's not something to be taken lightly. Now, as you might recall in myth number 1, I explained why there might be certain situations where a company really should protest. You really have no choice. And in every walk of life, as you know, a reputation, including a company's reputation, is an important part of its success. And its reputation could be harmed in the US government contracting world if it's known as a business that protests everything. But more about that a bit later. The filing of a bid protest, regardless of the forum, so that is whether you file at an agency, at the GAO, or at the Court of Federal Claims, generally leads to a lot of work for the government personnel that have to deal with it, that have to deal with responding to your protest. The CO and their team have to devote a significant amount of time to assembling all of the relevant documents and preparing an agency report. Agency counsel will be required to work with the contracting officer's team to understand the procurement, to understand the relevant facts, and to figure out the strength of the protesters' arguments. If the agency should decide that corrective action is necessary, that should not generate any ill will toward the protester. On the other hand, if a company files one spurious protest after another, that could lead to problems over time. And in that sense, don't ever underestimate the power of a government employee, regardless of rank. If you have offended or angered someone in a customer agency, they have ways of doing or not doing things that can have an impact on your company, and they can do it without leaving any tracks. For example, the exercise of a contract option is a unilateral decision on the part of the government. And the government's failure to exercise your option is not something that you can hope to successfully challenge, either in a protest or in a claim. Likewise, a miffed contracting officer might simply fail to process a request for equitable adjustment that you have filed, or they might have failed to include your company on an emergency solicitation shortlist. In other words, your faucet can be turned off without your having a clue. Because of this raw power, smart contractors avoid doing something like filing a spurious protest that could anger your customers. Now, chasing a government contract can be an expensive and arduous process. And I have not met many executives willing to admit that their company did not submit a very good proposal. Likewise, I have never met a disappointed offeror who believes that they had gotten a fair shake on a procurement where they had lost. Now, when you lose in a procurement, you get a letter that I'll call, for lack of a better title, the Dear John letter, right? The bad news letter. That Dear John letter that goes to disappointed offerors, when it's received, can lead to very negative feelings, even anger. But the appropriate course of action has to be decided without letting emotions get in the door. Many people who receive these Dear John letters immediately want to file a protest. But in a negotiated procurement, you generally have to wait until you have completed the debriefing process before you can file. So the very first step is to file, once you get the Dear John letter, is to file a timely request for a debriefing. File it in writing if a debriefing is available. And that, in my view, should be done immediately and no later than 24 hours after you get your Dear John letter. They say you have 3 days. Don't wait for the full 3 days. If you are offered a chance to attend an in-person debriefing, take it. And regardless of the type of debriefing you are offered, whether it's in person, whether it's by phone or Zoom or in writing, always take the first date offered. Why? Because your protest period might start to run on that offered date, and your risk of filing an untimely protest will have increased dramatically if you decline the first date that is offered to you. Now, when you get this Dear John letter, read it carefully. Some agencies will use it to provide a written debriefing, which means your protest period, in theory, might start to tick on the date you received the letter. Although the truth is that a debriefing is not completed until you've had an opportunity to get answers to reasonable questions. But agencies can tell you, gee, you didn't do anything after 3 days after you got the letter, so you're out. Although the law is not on their side on that. But it is something agencies like to do. That is, give you that written debriefing. Other agencies might say, yes, you can have a debriefing, but they give you specific instructions relating to the debriefing. For example, the Army might tell you that you've got to submit questions in advance of the debriefing, and that the failure to submit those questions in advance means that no questions will be entertained at the debriefing. Once again, experienced counsel can provide valuable assistance in addressing either of these common situations. Now, the debriefing itself offers an opportunity for the company to make a good impression on the customer. Take advantage of it. Prepare for a debriefing by reviewing the applicable regulations, and those would be FAR 15.505 or FAR 15.506. And if it's a DoD procurement, the DoD FAR supplement regulations that flow from those. And using those regulations, prepare a list of reasonable questions that you want to get answered at the debriefing. And you'll know, if you read the regulations, what information you are entitled to. At the debriefing, avoid hostility or inflammatory remarks. Don't mention the P word. The P word is protest. Don't mention it. And maintain a poker face. In other words, be professional. Further, give some thought to who should attend your debriefing on your behalf. As a matter of policy, as a general rule, I don't recommend including a lawyer. That sends the wrong message. Your goal in a debriefing is to obtain as much information as possible. And bringing a lawyer into that debriefing will often cause the government representatives to clam up. You might as well put a microphone on that table and watch them clam up. Once your debriefing is over, confer with experienced counsel and discuss the situation. Your counsel should have what they need to advise you as to whether a protest is advisable. And in many cases, you'll be told it is not. This is just another example of how a smart business person has to pick their battles. Now, filing and pursuing protests can be expensive. If your protest is before the GAO or the U.S. Court of Federal Claims, it's very likely that a protective order will govern the matter. So what's a protective order? Well, it means that only the lawyers representing the various parties will be able to see the full unredacted record. You, as the business people, will not be able to see it. This is frustrating for someone paying the bills, but protective orders are designed to prevent the competing companies from seeing each other's information and knowing what they bid and seeing their confidential information, as well as the government source selection information in case this thing goes back for another round of proposals. Now, while some of the protest costs might be reimbursed if you're successful, that should never be the motivating factor in the decision-making process as to whether or not to file a protest. Instead, you should focus on the facts and the law, your relationship with the agency in question. For example, what if you have another big proposal outstanding with this agency? Do you really want to file a protest now? You should consider your commitment to your team of subcontractors who can't file their own protests and the potential expense. These are all things you need to consider. All of them need to be weighed in a very short period of time, which means considerable pressure. So, taking a position at either end of the protest spectrum, we will always protest, we will never protest, without knowing the facts is silly. A smart contractor weighs a variety of actions, including advice from experienced counsel, in deciding whether and when to protest.